If we're going to trust any birth narratives from the ancient world, then I think the gospel birth narratives should be among the foremost of those.
Can you actually trust the gospel birth narratives? I'm Nate Hansen, and today on Faith Lab, we're getting into the hard questions, the census, the genealogies, with New Testament scholar Caleb Friedeman, who studied 95 ancient biographies and found something that reframes how we should evaluate Matthew and Luke.
I take a sample of 95 biographies outside the Gospels that I look at their birth material and analyze it. So 95 biographies from authors like Cornelius Nepos, Philo, Plutarch, Suetonius. One of the things I analyze is the time elapsed between when the person was born and then when the biographer wrote. So how much time was there between when this person was born and the biographer who's writing about it? On average, across all those 95 biographies, the average time elapsed is 360 years. So what that means is in the vast majority of cases, even when the biographers are doing their very best work, the best that they have to rely on is typically written sources. So very, very, very rarely are they having a chance to go and talk to either eyewitnesses or people who knew eyewitnesses. And when you run that same comparison for Matthew and Luke, now, obviously, scholars differ as to when Matthew and Luke were written. But even if you just kind of take a midline, this is a general consensus kind of date, Matthew and Luke are breathing rarefied air when it comes to their proximity to the events they're reporting. And they would have almost certainly had the opportunity to interview people who were close to eyewitnesses. So, for example, Jesus' brother James or Jude, or perhaps the Apostle Peter. They would have almost certainly had access to people like that in their networks. When we're looking at their genealogies, we have to recognize that the sources that they're working with are probably far better than what most ancient biographers are working with most of the time. And so I think that really does factor into how we evaluate these sources and the kinds of information they're likely to be able to pass on to us. So if Matthew and Luke both intend to give us a historical story, they're in a far better position to do that than most of their peers among ancient biographers.
Here's the other side of that. If you're writing this close to the events, people can check your work.
Yeah, I think you've stated it quite well. Not only does it tell us that they have good sources to work with in all likelihood, also the cost of deception is much higher. They'll be much more prone to having someone actually fact check them and find that they've made a mistake. So yeah, I think the likelihood of them simply lying about something is very low.
So when Caleb puts all of this together, what gives him the most confidence?
I guess for me, it's kind of a historiographic equation complex, right? Where I say, okay, on the one hand, again, are these stories intended to be true? I see lots of evidence that Matthew and Luke are both operating with historiographic intent. And then I also see, based on just when they were written and the kinds of sources that they're working with, the fact that they're part of this close-knit early Christian community, right, that would have involved people like Jesus's brothers, James and Jude. They may have even had a chance to talk with people like Mary, and certainly the 12 apostles who had a lot of interaction with Jesus. They're part of that community as well. When I think about that situation and the fact that Matthew and Luke are really trying to give us a true story, and then I also regard the kinds of sources that they were working with, to me, that seems like a very compelling situation, right? An overarching hypothesis that says, hey, we have good reason to trust these things. And also, I think for me, the comparison that I mentioned to other ancient biographies, I think when you bring in the other literature outside the Gospels, I think if anything, it simply underlines how excellent of access Matthew and Luke have to sources and just how unique the gospel birth narratives are. Scholars will pretend like the gospel birth narratives are worthy of this extraordinary skepticism. I would say, if anything, they are worthy of trust. If we're going to trust any birth narratives from the ancient world, then I think the gospel birth narratives should be among the foremost of those.
That's the big picture. Now let's stress test it, starting with the genealogies, because Matthew and Luke don't give us the same family tree.
Matthew and Luke have different goals from each other. Just on a very basic level, Matthew wants to come descending from Abraham, right? So he's going to move down the genealogical tree, we might say. Luke is definitely going to move backward, right? So he's going to count back from Jesus to Adam. Matthew is going to, as far back as he goes, as Abraham. Luke is going to go all the way back to Adam. So just on the very basic level, you can say they're trying to highlight different things. They both go back to David, but Matthew goes back through Solomon, and Luke goes back through Nathan. So we look at that as moderns and we say, well, that couldn't be right. Well, there's an assumption built into that, though, and the assumption is this, that you actually can't be the son of two different people at the same time. Right. So we have this notion of adoption where when someone is adopted or when they're someone's child, in order to be someone's child, you have to stop being someone else's child. If someone is adopted, then you cease legally to be one person's child, and then you start to be someone else's child. So we have this assumption there. But in Judaism, which also practice adoption, I've got an article on this from 2020 in the journal New Testament Studies. Judaism had a practice and a concept of adoption, but it didn't work like that. You could actually be regarded and accounted as being the son of more than one person at once. And one interesting example of this is levirate marriage. Right, so we have this idea in the Old Testament where if someone doesn't actually have a son, if a man doesn't have a son and he dies, well, then his brother can go and actually raise up seed for him. In other words, raise up a descendant for him with his wife after this man has died. But then the child that emerges can be regarded as the son of both, right? So a great example of this is the book of Ruth. So Ruth's original husband dies. So then what should happen? Well, the kinsman redeemer should enter the picture and raise up a descendant for her deceased husband, which Boaz eventually does. But if you look at the end of Ruth, in the genealogy at the end of Ruth, whose son is her son? Obed. So Obed is the son of, and he's the son of Boaz. In the clearest instance that we know of where something like levirate marriage went on in the Old Testament, you actually have the person that comes out being credited to his biological father and not to his deceased adoptive father who he's supposed to be credited to, right? So actually both could be true. So what that means, I think, is that Jewish genealogies can be very complex, and particularly in a royal line like David's line, right, where it might be important to trace a line of descent. I think there's a lot of room for complexity in a genealogy like that. And so what I want to say is I think we need to recalibrate our assumptions and approach it from that kind of angle.
So the short version, in Jewish genealogies, you could be the son of more than one person at the same time. That could change how we read these lists.
One of the basic things I think we can say for sure is that Matthew is interested in following the royal line, the line of kings that, goes from David to Solomon and through kings descended from Solomon. Matthew is very interested in following that line. Whatever Luke is giving us is the non-royal line. So yes, it's coming through a son of David named Nathan, but this line is not the line of kings that was ruling. So this is a non-royal line in that sense. And so I think Matthew's going to give us the royal line, Luke is giving us the non-royal line. And the question is just how do those things ultimately align and accord with each other? Lines that come from kings can get very complex, right? Because obviously there's an interest in preserving those lines. And you can even see that, I think, in modern royal lines. Royal lines especially, or lines that come from kings, can become very complex. Let's just say, for example, that at some point, this royal line that comes from Solomon and the non-royal line that comes through Nathan, that at some point, those ultimately do overlap because perhaps a lack of candidates to carry on the line, right? Interestingly, the two figures where they overlap, Zerubbabel and Shealtiel, Nancy Dawson has pointed out that these occur around the time of the exile, when there might have been a significant lack of people who could carry on that line, at least biologically. If that's true, and sort of you have this overlap, then, well, what if Jesus really does have a complex lineage that involves both parts or two parts of the Davidic line, right? Well, then Matthew can try to tell us all of that at once, sure. But what if he doesn't want to try to give us this twofold genealogy and he has to pick one of them? So then Matthew decides to give us the royal line and Luke decides to give us the non-royal line, perhaps because Luke actually knows that Matthew already gave us the royal line.
The other big flashpoint is Luke's census. Some have wondered if there's historical basis for it. Do you think the census actually happened?
I do. Yeah.
Because I've heard in the grapevine of who knows what that there's no historical basis for the census. So what's your take on that?
I'd say that there are a couple issues in play, and those make it complex. One is, what is Luke even trying to say in this passage where he talks about this census and mentions Quirinius? Is he trying to say that there was a census that took place while Quirinius was governing Syria? Or some scholars have argued that he's trying to say that this is before that census, right? So that's kind of the linguistic issue that you're up against. And that, by the way, that there is one potential solution there to say, actually, this is talking about an earlier census than the one when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Again, we're in the truth realm here, and I'll want to emphasize that what I focus on so far in the book that I've written is intent. But in terms of the truth question, I do think we have to think about what is Luke trying to say, and there's some ambiguity there in terms of what he might be trying to say in that passage. The other thing that I'd want to emphasize is that there's nothing that tells us that this can't be true, right? Now, what we would have to say is that if this happened, no other ancient author that we have, while Quirinius was governing Syria, we have no other ancient author mentioning it. So there might be a silence outside of Luke, but some people want to say because Luke is the only source that talks about this, well, that must mean that it can't have happened. And I want to say perhaps Luke actually is a reliable source that we should take seriously on this point. And if there's some question about how to line Luke up with Josephus, then we should engage in that task and try to look at, okay, what are the various options for how Luke and Josephus might relate to each other? Interestingly, Luke is almost certainly writing a good bit earlier than the account of Josephus that a lot of people tried to match him up with. So that is one interesting point that I think often doesn't come into the conversation, that Luke may actually be closer to the events than Josephus is. And I think there may be a way of reconciling Luke and Josephus and allowing both to be true or correct. But I think I want to take both sources seriously when doing that work as a historian.
What about the details that only show up in one account, like the Magi in Matthew or the shepherds in Luke?
I think a lot of it can have to do with, their overarching purpose, what they're trying to achieve with their story. So let's just take maybe one example of that. And by the way, one other thing that could really impact that is if one author knows the other and doesn't simply want to duplicate what the author they know has done, that might lead them to do something different, right? So in my opinion, the fact that you have differences, if they're not really differences that are disagreements, those don't really provide any kind of ground for saying, I don't trust this source. So I think what I'd be interested in talking about, if there's going to be a problem, it would need to be a problem of some kind of a real disagreement. But I think it's quite possible, for example, that Luke knows Matthew and is including intentionally some material that Matthew doesn't. And then I think it's always good to dig into what exactly is each author trying to do. For example, Luke, I think, has structured his story around 7 different scenes. And each one has an instance of what I call inspired speech. So some angel or human speaks on behalf of God. So I think he's structured his story in that way. Now, it is a story of events that actually took place, but he's decided to select some events that took place and make sure that he includes those. And interestingly, in Luke's story, the climactic 7th speaker who speaks on behalf of God is Jesus himself. He's the one who speaks in that last story when he's speaking with his parents. Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? So I think Luke has a reason for structuring his story in that way. So it doesn't bother me particularly that Luke has shepherds and Matthew has magi. I can see reasons why Luke might not have wanted to mention magi, and I suppose Matthew might have reasons for not wanting to mention shepherds. But I would just say I don't think it's a realistic historiographic standard to say these two sources must overlap on everything in order for us to take either one of them seriously.
What would be some of the reasons why Matthew wouldn't include shepherds and Luke wouldn't include magi, or was it the other way around?
Well, one thing that scholars will note with Luke and magi, at least, is that there is at least one person, Simon Magus, in Acts, who has that kind of word attributed to him, or a similar word, where that's a negative situation. So it's possible that that's the reason. But I think part of it may just be Luke's knowledge of Matthew, for example.
Like he would just say, oh, Matthew already told that story, so I'm going to...
Maybe he doesn't want to simply duplicate what Matthew said.
But duplicate in plenty of other situations.
Sure. Yeah, but Luke, for example, you have other examples like that in the body of the gospel. So Matthew has this beautiful Sermon on the Mount, which Luke has a good bit of that content, but distributed across his gospel. We look at Matthew's Sermon on the Mountain and say, well, why in the world would Luke have, if Luke knew Matthew, right? Why would he have broken that up and distributed it differently? And I think there are various explanations for that. But the truth is, Luke did do that, right? So what I might expect Luke to do is not what Luke did, right? Or at least what some people would expect Luke to do. So I think we always have to try to think about it from the ancient author's perspective and see how they would have viewed it. And then I think it's also helpful to think about how we would do this if it were another historical source. For example, back to our eyewitness of a car crash kind of scenario, right? If we found that a car crash had occurred and we had different eyewitness accounts of that, and those eyewitness accounts were compatible but different, what would we probably try to do with those accounts? I think we'd probably try to put them together wherever possible. And as long as those were trustworthy witnesses and we didn't think that they were trying to deceive us or something like that, we would probably do our best to put those two different perspectives together if they were compatible and just assume that each witness, was telling us a different part of the story. And I think that may very well be what's going on in Matthew and Luke.
So the hard questions do have real responses. Not simple ones, but real ones. So what does all of this mean for how we actually read these stories? What are some habits that you would recommend to read these responsibly?
Well, I think one thing I'd say is just read them the way that you would read other parts of the Gospels. A lot of people have tried to treat the birth narratives in the Gospels as being a unique case and uniquely worthy of skepticism, both in terms of intent and truth. And I would say that's just unwarranted. I think that we should read these parts of the Gospels the way that we read the rest of the Gospels. The more that we can be aware of the conventions of ancient biographies, the better. So Mike Licona, for example, has done great work in this area. Craig Keener is another scholar who's done some good work here. So the more that you can know how ancient biographies were intended to be read, that can really be helpful. And there's some great material that's out there at the popular level, YouTube, podcast form. You don't necessarily have to go buy an expensive scholarly book. And I don't want to try to rehearse all of that here. But I do think the more that you can be aware of how ancient biographies worked and recognize that that's what the Gospels are and the birth narratives are doing that kind of thing, as are the rest of the Gospels, the better. The other thing that I'd say is part of that means really taking seriously the historiographic intent of the authors. That's throughout the Gospels, not just in the birth narratives, but take seriously the historiographic intent. And then I'd also say, as a third thing, be sensitive to the theological dimensions of these stories. I think just in terms of understanding the value and what they're indicating about Jesus, which really is the focus of both the Gospels. Who is Jesus, right? Both these Gospels that we're dealing with, Matthew and Luke, they're trying to tell us who Jesus is. And they're doing that in a way that's historical, but they're also doing it in a way that's deeply theological. And one of the main ways that the Gospel authors, especially Matthew and Luke, indicate who Jesus is and help to draw the theological significance of events is through their use of the Old Testament. That can be both in terms of quotations and in terms of allusions, where they're alluding to the Old Testament. And if you pick up on those allusions, like that allusion to Daniel 7:28 that we talked about earlier, that can really enrich your readings of these stories.
If you had to summarize your core claim in a sentence or two or a short statement, what would it be?
Matthew and Luke wrote their birth material with historiographic intent. They intended these stories to be true, historically speaking, and they did their best work and put their best effort into trying to tell us a story that was both historically true and theologically meaningful.
If you're a Faith Lab member, the full unedited conversation with Caleb is available right now. You'll hear a much longer discussion about the genealogies, and Shelby asks whether Mary might have even contradicted the Magi story. And there's an extended conversation about what eyewitness testimony actually looks like in practice, using a pretty intense real-life example. The link to that is in the show notes. Thank you so much for being with us today, sharing an episode with a friend, leaving a 5-star review. These things all help the show reach more people. And a big thank you to everyone who gives financially to help this work go on and continue to help more and more people. Thank you.